Hello and good evening to everyone in the UK and good afternoon to our American audience. Welcome to our first webinar event, History Repeating. I'm Freya and I'm honoured to be opening this event as spokeswoman for Feminists Against Antisemitism. We're an organisation dedicated to confronting the denial of sexual violence on October 7th and also challenging the exclusion of Jewish and Israeli women from feminist solidarity and discourse. Thank you to every single one of you who've purchased a ticket for today, and especially to those who were able to share a donation. Your support means we can invite more speakers and plan in-person events too. You can follow this event online at X, where one of our fabulous volunteers is going to be live tweeting. Please do share and amplify her work, and feel free to respond with any thoughts on what has been said tonight. Anti-Semitism has a long, painful history that has repeatedly resurfaced in ways we cannot ignore. Today, we ask a courageous question: has anti-Semitism taken root within feminism itself? This is not about blame or division. It is about recognizing patterns, learning from them, and doing the hard work of liberation for all women. Tonight's discussion will explore how anti-Semitism appears in contemporary feminist spaces, how it can be denied or minimized, and how all of us can better understand and resist it. This is not an abstract idea, but is something that affects real lives and real movements. We are deeply grateful to our speakers for bringing their insight, experience, and care to this conversation. They are Jesella, author and scholar, whose forthcoming book, coming in June, I think, traces the history of anti-Semitism within the feminist movement. Zoe Stimpel, Telegraph columnist and social historian, and of course, our moderator, Nicole Lampert, freelance journalist, broadcaster, and commentator who writes regularly on anti-Semitism, Israel, and women's rights. So without further ado, I'm delighted to hand over to Nicole, who will be moderating your panel. Nicole, thank you for leading us in what promises to be a meaningful and necessary discussion.
Thank you, Freya, and thank you, Freya, Ali, and Josie, Feminists Against Antisemitism, for setting up this webinar. And it actually comes at a time when Zoe and I have been working on an article together about this issue, and Cara has written a book about it. So hopefully we are three women that are kind of right at the heart of it. And for me, coming into it, and the reason that Zoe and I started writing a story about it was after I attended Philia with the three founders of this movement. And you may be aware of what happened there, of calls for free Palestine right at the opening plenary, when it was meant to be a politics-free zone, a fight on the Saturday night, people being thrown out of the event, pro-Palestine demonstrations outside, Jewish women being harassed. And we're also talking at a time which is, of course, very interesting with what's happening in that part of the world, what we're seeing in Iran. And already I'm seeing some of those same conflicts that we had as Jewish women in terms of the Iranian women. And of course, many of us have been involved in the women life freedom movement and speaking for the women of Iran. And some of those people that are pro-Palestinian are keeping silent on what's happening in Iran at the same time, which may be something that we get into. But certainly, as a feminist, after October 7, and as someone as a journalist who was writing and speaking to people in their safe rooms as the attack was happening, seeing what was happening, and of course some of those iconic, horrific images that we won't ever forget of some of the Israeli women being bundled into lorries with bloodstains, their bodies being hauled around the streets. We could see immediately that there was a sexualized part of this. And one of the most painful moments for me as a feminist has seen not only some feminists trying to somehow diminish this or say almost the Israeli women deserved it, but the rape denialism. We're going to go back firstly a bit into history, but before we even do that, I'd kind of like to discuss with Zoe and Cara anti-Semitism, Antizionism, what they both are. I'm just going to recommend a book that I'm reading, Be a Refusenit, which is by the great Isabella Taborowski. And if you haven't seen her work, she's definitely worth reading in terms of Soviet anti-Zionism and this movement that was pushed at the UN. And it's something that Zoe and Cara will both be talking about, the 1975 and the 1980 feminist conferences that the UN held, which were meant to be about women and were really about Zionism. And that this is almost part of the problem and something that we'll be discussing as women, which is how, in many ways, anti-Zionism has held feminism back. But in the meantime, let me put it to you, maybe Cara, you want to go first, about anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and how you see them as different or the same.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much, first of all, for Nicole and Zoe for being here with me, to Feminists Against Antisemitism for having me. And I mean, I think there's many great definitions of anti-Semitism. I think the easiest for our purposes is hostility towards Jews and Judaism. And a lot of this comes from Christian, the Middle Ages, with the rise of Christianity, and Jews were considered Christ killers. And you'll see this idea. One of the things that we now know about anti-Semitism is it morphs into all kinds of new ideas. So this will morph into what Jews call the blood libel, the idea that Jews use the blood of Christians in their matzah at Passover. And we see this get recycled into a kind of anti-Zionism. When we're talking about the Gaza war, we hear all the time, Jews are killing babies, Israelis are killing babies. This is sort of a way of playing on this old blood libel. There's also ethnic and racial prejudice. So this is how we get to the Holocaust, right? Nazis thought of Jews as race polluters. We're not Aryan. That's how we get to 6 million people being killed, 6 million Jews being killed. And a lot of times what we'll see is that the ways Jews were discriminated against actually ends up playing into stereotypes about them. So as an example, there's oppression against Jews in the Middle Ages by Christians. They're not allowed to own land, so we can't be farmers. And Christians were not allowed to lend money to each other with interest. So Jews become moneylenders. Like, this is because we are discriminated against, we become moneylenders. And we see how this has morphed over the years, where Jews become the greedy capitalists. Karl Marx, in his famous essay on the Jewish question, we become exemplary capitalists there. And to this day, this idea is still out there. And again, Israel gets characterized the same way. It sort of represents this capitalist country. And anti-Zionism is hostility, I would say passionate hostility towards the Jewish state. So in 1948, the modern state of Israel is established, and the Arab countries aren't happy about it. And in 1967, we have the Six-Day War, and Israel very quickly wins this war against its Arab neighbors, and it gains new land. And Isabella Tabarovsky, who Nicole just mentioned, she speaks about this, about how the Soviet Union could not understand how little Israel could possibly defeat these Soviet-sponsored armies. And they thought, well, the US must be involved somehow. And the Soviets realized that they weren't going to be able to win on the battlefield. So instead, they waged this disinformation campaign. And they made Israel into the enemy of everything that the global left cares about. So Israel is fascist, Israel is racist, Israel is capitalist, Israel is settler colonialist. And so we can think of these things, and this is actually a big conversation in the Jewish community, we can think of these things as distinct, as both hate movements against Jews. Often the way that Jews are characterized will then get transferred to Israel, and the negative ways that Israel is characterized is transferred to Jews.
That feels pretty, there's a lot you said there. I don't know if Zoe, if you have anything to add, because Cara covered it a lot.
Yeah, no, that was great, and I want to echo the thanks to you, brave women, for doing this event. It's one of those it's a very cognitively dissonant area because people want to think feminists on the side of the good and fighting injustice, and then there's this kind of dark thing emerging right in the center of it, of which more later. So I would slightly modify, or sorry, not modify, but kind of I have a slightly different way of looking at anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, which actually kind of unites them a little bit more and explains some of the more surprising instances, I think, of anti-Semitism. And that is this theory or term called the pattern, which is an idea that David Deutsch, he's actually a physicist, but he's quite a well-known sort of cultural theorist as well, has come up with. And what the pattern means, and this is the best explanation or description I've ever heard of anti-Semitism. It's the urge to legitimize the harming of Jews. So the emphasis is actually on the legitimizing rather than on sort of hatred of Jews, because we know for a fact that a lot of people who endorse the most, frankly, genocidal anti-Semitism in the form of, praising Hamas or whatever, may very well have Jewish friends. They may very well see a Jew on the street and they won't spit with rage. They are not particularly preoccupied necessarily, although often they are, with the Aryan iteration of anti-Semitism. So there is something lurking beneath that fires these logics of anti-Semitism, and I'm not, it's very hard to know what that is without getting into epistemology and all that. But I think this definition, it really helps us understand why so often, politicians, very mainstream ones, whether they be Wes Streeting or newspapers like the FT, who are otherwise, there are clearly a lot of Jews there, a lot of centrists, a lot of normal people there who aren't going to meet a Jew and erupt into anti-Semitism. There's still elements of this urge to legitimize the harming of Jews, whether it be by downplaying what bad actors in Palestine are doing, whether it's by downplaying what students on campuses are doing, whether it's by downplaying who's funding them, and massively upplaying the Jew or the Israeli, who are often, obviously, but not always, interchangeable, as the kind of evil. And then once you understand that kind of huge machination or machinery of legitimizing. So we live in a world now where it's completely legitimate and respectable to come up to kind of repeat lies about Israel. Then you get into, obviously everything Kara said so articulately about the way blood libels and all these other kind of mutant ideas about Jews emerge. So that's what I would say. And I think it also really helps us begin to approach these questions of leftist anti-Semitism, of which feminist anti-Semitism is a strand.
Which leads me really well into kind of the next kind of question. And I should just say, although Zoe has an American accent, she's British based, and we'll be talking very much
British born, no less.
Born, okay. So, and she'll be talking very much about the kind of the British side of things and Cara of the American side, because although there are parallels, there are also two quite different stories, and that's what I'd like to get into to start with, which is maybe Zoe, if you want to start about the kind of the story of British feminism and where anti-Semitism first comes into that. And then, Cara, you can do the same for American feminism.
Well, I'm not an expert by any stretch on the sort of longer history of British feminism. I do know that there was a strong anti-Semitic element in the first wave of suffragettes, not suffragists, which were kind of thought of now as some of them proto-fascists, basically. So that's an interesting thing to note. Whether that's intimately tied to the cause of women, that would be a tricky one to answer, but it's there. It's there in the early 20th century. And women in that suffragette and suffragist movement had to go off and form their own kind of league of Jewish feminists in 1912 because they were being constantly discredited. Everything they said was turned against them, used against them, and so on. Obviously, this is long before Israel. So then the British movement is, I think, from my understanding, different from the American movement, mainly in that the US feminist movement is a bit more radical. The British movement's much more based in socialism and the socialist politics of the movement from the 60s and much earlier. And British feminists, I think this is probably the same, but the women's liberation movement in the UK emerged, pretty directly out of the leftist liberatory movements of the 1960s, when women who were, tired of running around after the Jeremy Corbyns of the world, and felt that maybe the trade union movement was, all these kind of left-wing causes and movements and anti-war and whatever that they were in, had a lot of problems with misogyny. So that's kind of that was the sort of the thinking behind the eruption of the formal kind of launch, I guess, of the movement in 1970. Obviously not just we want to broach those left-wing issues without the sexism, but also, this radical new idea that women's lives were in themselves political, and how they were sort of discussed, thought of, and that would be inherently tied to rights. And I think that the big sort of commonality is the personal is political. That was very much, consciousness raising. There are some really important similarities. But yes, I would say that the British movement was always kind of very suffused with this much longer standing, much more present socialism. And maybe because of where Britain is in the world geographically, but it was, I think, more internationalist from the start. It didn't necessarily have the same sharp focus of the US civil rights movement, from which a lot of, American feminism kind of borrowed or emerged from. So it was always a little bit more woolly in terms of its interests in kind of internationalist causes. But the issue with Israel, I think, it's well documented that the Labour Party, which, you could argue is maybe the umbrella party into which, if you had to pick a party, women's liberation would fall, they were already becoming, buying the Soviet line about Israel being, the imperialist, oppressive, racist force from the early 70s. And that was sort of still, though, in the UK, unlike today, by the way, considered a fringe position. But the fringe left is where British feminism came from. But it wasn't the main preoccupation in the 70s. In fact, even in Spare Rib magazine, which I'll get to in a sec, feminists were going off to kibbutzim, including like Shulamit Firestone, some of the American ones, but then they later became very anti-Israel. But there was this brief moment when it was totally legit, and in fact, part of the sort of identity to go to Israel and work on the land and so on. And then a lot of them come back and then later start revisiting that and, undermining that they did that and saying actually they were dupes of this kind of propaganda machine and so on. But that hadn't happened yet. The real turning point. So, okay, the 70s also sees UN women.
Let's go to the Spare Rib afterwards, because I want to go to Cara and Betty Friedan.
So not do Spare Rib now. So just stick. Okay, right. So the 70s. The last thing I'll say then, and do cut me off whenever, Nicole, because I really can go on and on. But the UN Women had been kind of rumbling away, but became it started having its kind of signature, conferences. The first one was 1975 in Mexico City, and then there's 1980, and that is one of the sharpest moments where you see the UN is part of this international rightsy, humanitarian-y kind of new movement, really, new discourse that is just openly anti-Semitic, never mind anti-Zionist, using Israel in a very, very blatant way, like nothing to the imagination, to support a deeply anti-Semitic, aggression, which shocked the likes of Betty Friedan, who hadn't, a lot of these feminists, Jewish feminists were just assumed in good faith that it was going to be about all women and whatever and Jews, but it was like on a different level. And I think just one final thing I'll say in this bit is that it's interesting when you look at the big players who are funding and supporting and helping people to be so anti-Semitic at these UN events, and it's very similar. In that case, the Soviet interest is kind of behind a lot of it, but it's very easy to do. I mean, people are very willing to be propagandized and used to spout all this venom to legitimize the harming of Jewish women, frankly. Just like now on the campuses and so on, there are also these kind of funders from who, Iran or whoever, wherever these, anti-Israel Middle Eastern sources of funding are coming from. And people are lapping that up as well. And so it's sort of the West as useful idiots, then and now. So by the late 70s, it's bad in the UN, but feminism really only goes really sour after the Lebanon War in 1982. So I can stop it there because then I really have to go into spare rib.
Yeah. So Cara, you want a little bit about the kind of, in some ways, how Jewish feminists were much more at the center of American feminism. And then tell us a little bit more about those two UN conferences and some of the horrors that happened there. And then we'll go with Zoe into the spare rib thing, which probably lots of our older women who are British here will remember.
Absolutely. That was the perfect introduction, because some of the words that you said, Zoe, are exactly what, I think you said fringe left, socialism, internationalism. Those three things are all going to play a huge role in American feminism as well. So, we when we think about the second wave of the women's movement, we think 1963 with Betty Friedan, and she writes The Feminine Mystique. And in that book, she says, middle-class, educated women are unhappy, and the cure is for them to go work outside the home. And sort of the first people to really push back against this, besides men, are radical Black women who say, like, we've been working outside the home this whole time. You're not accounting for us. We've been working for the kind of women who are reading your book, who underpay us and don't treat us well. We're not all sisters. Friedan very much had a vision of, international sisterhood and women banding together, no matter where they were in the world, and that they were all going to fight. However patriarchy manifested in the places where they lived, they were going to fight it together. And these important radical Black feminists say, like, it's not that easy. We don't feel like we're sisters with you. And they start to really build their own body of theory, which is often against what they call white women or white feminism. Feminism begins to sort of see itself as different strands. Like, there's socialists, there's women's liberationists, there's the more liberal, the Betty Friedan type feminism, which is more liberal, and radical Black women who will later call themselves Black feminists say, you're all white women, you're white feminists, and they develop their own feminism. And their feminism, they want to overthrow the world economic order. It's much more anti-capitalist and socialist than liberal feminism, which is like a little, depending on the thinker, it could be like a little bit anti-capitalist, but theirs is much more radical. They often are supportive of non-state violence in order to achieve their goals. And they're not particularly interested in allying with these women that they call white women. So they say, like, we want to join forces with people of color internationally to overthrow this world order that is oppressing all of us. There's a feminist scholar named Cheryl Higashida, and she calls it Black internationalist feminism. And this becomes really one of the bases for academic feminism. So academic feminism is really going to develop in opposition to Betty Friedan's feminism. And so that sort of takes us to the first UN Women's Conference, the International Women's Year Conference in 1975. And Friedan is she's the most famous attendee there. And she represents America, but she represents the West in general. People think that, this is Western feminism. And she gets there, and there's all kinds of media about her. It's in Mexico City, and the press is going to, they're going to give her, like, when they write about her, they'll give her other Jewish last names. They'll call her Betty Friedag instead of Betty Friedan. They'll talk about how she has a big nose, which is a classic anti-Semitic stereotype, trying to make Jews seem, make them seem like they're of a different race. And there's one article that's going to be called Betty Friedan versus the Third World. So right away, and the historian Jocelyn Alcott has written about this, but right away, you're going to get this idea of like the Jewish woman against the Third World. And this was shocking to Friedan. And it's actually at this conference where the socialist countries who their delegates, some of whom were women, but actually some of them were men. So they were men that had been appointed by their governments. The socialist countries are really going to band together against Western feminism. And one of the ways they do this is by saying Zionism equals racism. Zionism is racism. And so the historian Jocelyn Alcott says, this is the first time that this language is used in a UN document. It's actually at this women's conference. And the UN General Assembly is going to later say the same thing a few months later. But we did it first, unfortunately. So, this is Betty Friedan thinks this is terrible. She's going to go out and say, well, I'm a Zionist. I've never called myself a Zionist before, but now I do. So now we have this image of Friedan that we still hear about today. There's books about white women and white feminism that have been really popular over the last several years. Betty Friedan is usually she's the one who becomes the one who exemplifies this. And she's very obviously a Jewish woman. Much has been written about that. And then to Zoe's other point, 5 years after this, there's another International Women's Year conference. It's in Copenhagen, and it's even worse for Jewish women. There's a Palestinian delegation. It's led by Leila Khaled, who had hijacked planes to draw attention to the Palestinian cause. And the delegation is disrupting event after event, session after session. They're yelling things like Jews must die, Israel must die. And Jewish women come away from this event saying, first of all, we have to do something about this. But also, saying that anti-Semitism seems to have morphed into anti-Zionism. So Phyllis Chesler, who some of you might know, she was an important feminist then, and she still writes about these issues now. She goes to a feminist conference after Copenhagen and says, what we are dealing with now is anti-Zionism. And this might take us to Spare Rib.
Seems to seed very nicely, Zoe.
Yes. Wow. Thank you, Cara. Very concise account of such a big and messy decade, I guess, and lots of different competing factors. And you perfectly kind of set the ground here for the role of race in entrenching norms within the movement of how to be anti-Semitic, unfortunately. So whereas I think this is one of the things that still befuddles people today, how can anti-racism not only be but engender anti-Semitism? And that's what we see play out. And yeah. So I joined as a postdoc looking at the business practices actually of the feminist movement, the women's liberation movement, because it was considered, it is an interesting question how anti-capitalist women engage with the marketplace in order to survive. And Spare Rib began as a fairly kind of a going concern. I mean, it was never going to be profitable, but it was like, it was on every news stand in the country, or rather in W.H. Smith from 1972 when it launched. And I'm only giving this slight background because not everyone necessarily might know about Spare Rib or know why it's kind of interesting or relevant or why it stands for the movement. And it was the only British, national publication devoted to the women's liberation movement, I think, that ever, I don't know what there is now, but that there weren't many of them. And so that was a big deal, that you could be a rural woman in Wales and go into your local newsagent and buy Spare Rib and be connected to this kind of really mind-blowing new set of ideas. And so at the beginning, it really did catch a lot of women's eye, and they read it and they responded, and there was a very lively letters page, and it was not at all just activists or academics. It was all kinds, and reading the early letters pages of Spare Rib is a really kind of interesting and moving experience, because you're just seeing it in real time. You're seeing women who've been in this incredibly, okay, it's the West, it's not like as bad as other areas, but it's, they couldn't, this was 5 years before the Equal Pay Act, and they couldn't necessarily get out a mortgage without a man's signature, and there's just general horrendous, every time they go to the pub they might risk being assaulted. So you're seeing them kind of suddenly realize that they're not alone. Housework is something that other people, basically the politics of the personal, you're seeing that. It's really, that is where the focus is. It's also women's health is a huge thing, and it's one of the kind of main things that readers and writers of Spare Rib are preoccupied with. And the international side of it isn't such a prominent aspect at all, in the first 7-8 years of Spare Rib. And that's what made it kind of an amazing magazine at that time. So then, the things, the kind of internationalism does come in. It's kind of the burgeoning sense that white women do not speak for everyone. I think at the beginning there's this kind of rush of excitement about the concept of what the sisterhood thing might do and consciousness raising, and it's just such a relief for everyone to be able to kind of get things off their chest. But then, as ever with this is a well-known aspect of most movements, and certainly most like liberatory movements, they curdle quite quickly, because, well, they don't curdle, but dissatisfaction, sects, like different bits kind of appear, cracks in it appear in the unity, and there starts being kind of civil war. So in this case, like I suppose we're 10 years in now of a whole range of academic practitioners of feminism, as you referred to. I mean, the British movement is a little harder to pinpoint in terms of stars. There really weren't the same mega stars like there were, like, the Gloria Steinems of the world, or even the Susan Brown Millers and the Shulamit Firestones. There weren't those. There was Germaine Greer, I guess, but ironically, she wasn't really she hated the movement. She wasn't part of it, really. But there's been a lot of time to work on these ideas and to kind of worry over them, and you start to develop these ideas about I'd say the antecedents of the idea of intersectionality is taking place, but just on a more, once they've had 5 or 6 years to really wrestle with ideas of women and power and misogyny and patriarchy and whatever, and because more women have a voice now, or feel they do, it really is only a matter of time before a portion of those women realize that actually, there's quite a lot of strength and power to be had in demanding a voice against a perceived enemy. And there's a kind of victim status, which I'm not saying is necessarily not valid in this case, but it's by now kind of a crucial part of the political toolbox to say, actually, you're when we're dividing up the power pie, you guys actually have all the power, and you pretend you don't, and we're not gonna, we're now gonna fight back. And this kind of revolutionary politics enters the kind of small world of British feminism, and race is becomes, through Spare Rib, the focal point. So the Spare Rib is, after the initial being run by an editorial, it becomes run by an editorial collective. So no one, has supposed to have any power over anyone else. Everything has to be decided on by everyone. But what happens is that there's a sense that these early editors of the magazine are too white and too privileged, and there were actually a lot of Jewish women, including some Jews with connected to quite prominent Jewish families. I think one of the Rothschilds was involved in some way at the beginning. So Jewish women become, one of the most classic moves, of course, and this is why intersectionality is such a problematic construct, is because it just automatically, quickly sorts Jewish women into basically embodying all the attributes of the oppressor, white privilege, blah, 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 ever shifting, using kind of international support to kind of get, like, nefarious things through, not the individual women, but that's the kind of Israel argument. So No, that was such a long sentence. I've kind of lost my train of thought there. But anyway, so what ends up happening is that the intersectionality and these other ideas have kind of neatly cast Jewish women as kind of dubious and suspicious. But this is part of this bigger war against white women in the editorial collective. By the early 80s, there starts to be very open, arguments, and basically the white women say, yeah, we need to stand back. We've had too much power. They buy it because they feel they have to. When the argument comes to be about Zionism in Israel, you see the collective, you see the Jewish women kind of wrestling with, well, we don't want to be these like bad, oppressor women. We want to be good women. And so when we're being told we're the oppressor, maybe we are the oppressor, maybe we should stand aside. By the 80s, no white women left in the collective of Spare Rib. And the members of the collective that take over are extremely preoccupied with Palestine. Then to the flashpoint, and then I'll leave it with this for now because I've just been going on and on, but a real flashpoint occurs around 1982, 1983. This is kind of the beginning of the end because Spare Rib actually ends up imploding slowly over the 80s as a result, in my view, of what happens in these 2 years. The magazine decides it emerges. The magazine has decided it is a anti-Israel, pro-Palestine editorial stance. That is what its stance is, and it believes that it needs to bring that into its editorial decisions. What that translates is publishing things by pro-Palestine groups, including some women who are Palestinian, that are incredibly anti, quote unquote anti-Zionist, but saying things like Israel's entire foundations are based on weaponizing European anti-Semitism against Palestinians. They're just making it all up basically so that they can kind of exert this kind of nasty reign of terror. It's that kind of level. So it's really awful. And then a flood of, Jews are still engaged at this point in Spare Rib. They still believe maybe there's room for their voices. Maybe they've got something to offer. Maybe they can persuade. They then get a few letters published. It goes back and forth. Then there's a kind of really hardcore anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic public things published. And then the magazine decides not to publish the letters of Jewish women in response. And that's a huge moment. And actually the national press starts to pick up on what's happening at Spare Rib, which, by now is not on the mainstream scene at all. But it basically, what Spare Rib is operating is an anti-Semitic editorial policy, which is that no Jewish woman can write for Spare Rib unless they declare their position on an international matter not to do with their own lives. So they can't, and they aren't allowed to just say they don't like the IDF. They have to kind of completely disavow Israel's right to exist, really. And this is picked up, as I say, even by The Guardian and places like that, because it does go too far. And anyway, from here, it leaves such a rancorous kind of bad taste that obviously all the women in the movement follow Spare Rib. Jewish women are completely, they are just disgusted by this point. They're not even Zionist women. They're just women who, 30, 40 years on from the Holocaust, like obviously Israel is meaningful to them. It's maybe ambivalent or ambiguous, but their Jewishness, they understand intuitively why anti-Semitism and Jewishness is bound up with kind of like the way Israel is kind of bandied around and stuff. So they go off and they realize like this movement's not for us anymore. The movement really goes bad at this point. And these debates about race kind of take over. And actually by the 90s, by the late 80s, Spare Rib is just a kind of mouthpiece of like Libya. It's so weird, actually. It becomes very peculiar in the causes that it kind of champions and the way in which it says things like, Israel using chemical weapons, like just making up lots of stuff. And it loses readers massively. No one wants to be part of this. I think what's really interesting is how the American movement, in my impression, and Cara, please, correct me on this, but my impression is that the 80s were a terrible decade for American feminism too, but slightly more to do with porn, the porn wars and things like that. Some things that were slightly more to do with women and objectification and sex and stuff like that. Whereas the British movement kind of totally lost its way over Israel and Jews. And it couldn't unpick how its anti-Zionism became anti-Semitism and couldn't unpick how that was all related with its anti-white race politics. And it's so hard to discuss and analyze these things because you don't want to sound like you support racism or that you think Black women shouldn't have a voice. But the way that anti-racism manifested in the 1980s in Spare Rib and in the movement beyond, and now again today, goes into really dark anti-Semitic terrain and understanding. I think that's why I always talk about the pattern. This, if something it ends up legitimizing the harming of Jews, you've got a problem. And if that thing is anti-racism, you've got a problem with your anti-racism, and it's probably not actually about anti-racism. So that's a kind of broad, probably really disorganized overview of the Spare Rib in the 80s and its decline.
Thank you. And it does see very nicely to then what happens in America, where this kind of anti-racism, intersectionality, these ideas take over academia. And definitely in America, we see that. And then we're seeing that crossing borders back here, or maybe it always was. So I don't know if you want to talk a bit about that, Cara, and kind of lead us up to almost modern day, certainly the BLM movement, the Women's March, and that kind of thing.
Absolutely. So, Zoe, I think actually exactly the same thing happened here. I also think 1982 was like the year it got really bad with the Lebanon War. And we had very similar situations. Like there was a magazine called Conditions, and it was a group of 4 lesbian women. 3 of them were Jews. And they, this idea of sharing power was so important. It was important on the left in general, and it was really important to feminists. So the idea is, if you have less power, I'm going to share my power with you. So they turned the magazine over to 2 Black women to do the Black women's issue. This is in 1979. And it's a huge, it becomes a text that's really important within women's studies. And in there are several poems that directly are against Jewish women. So this is like a moment where, like, before it was sort of like white women are bad, and internationally you hear things that are directly about Jews, but this is like a moment where like the American feminist movement starts targeting Jews directly by name. So there's like a poem that minimizes the Holocaust. There's another poem that talks about a Black Samson who's like killed by a Black Delilah. So it takes like a Jewish story, and it makes, the Black Delilah is like the hero for killing this like Jewish, for killing this Jewish character. And there's like another poem that makes clear that the woman is sort of the writer is talking about not liking, she says, not Anglo-Saxon. So she wants to make clear that it's like, she doesn't say it's Jews, but she says white women, not Anglo-Saxon. So it's like, again, like Jews are the ones who are being targeted. And there's all kinds of other texts at the same time. Women's Studies Quarterly runs a short story by a radical Black feminist writer it talks about Jewish women hiring Black housekeepers, and it characterized them as like slave traders. So we get and then we get this one other text, same time, 1979, that characterizes Jews as Aryan, which is, first of all, very painful to Jewish women because they say, we were just murdered en masse for not being Aryan. Now you're calling us Aryan. And it says that the white feminist movement is killing the Black family, and it's because of the leadership of Jewish women. So we get all of these like very anti-Semitic texts, and then Black and Jewish women try to work this out. So you then get you get future texts where it'll be like a transcription of a conversation between Black women and Jewish women trying to work these issues out. And this sort of like personal is political, I think actually it both allows anti-Semitism at this moment to fester, but then also kind of keeps it in check because they're talking about their own lives and they're trying to work in coalition with each other. But also, you'll hear things that are being published that people are reading that say, Black women will say, well, I the Jewish women I knew growing up seemed like they had it all right. Like they don't seem like a minority. So why are they being treated like a minority? And, these ideas, again, this becomes foundational within academic feminism. So as sort of time goes on, and once we get into the 1980s, we're going to see like new alliances that start to happen that are going to exclude Jewish women. And then we're going to get new theories, which Zoe was just speaking of, that are going to exclude Jewish women or treat them as they don't want to be treated. So this is like really the moment where women of color comes together as a political formation. So it's basically every group of minority women, Arab, Native American, Asian, everybody except Jewish women. And Jewish women are characterized as white. And many Jewish women say, like, well, we're not just regular white women. And some of these women, they themselves were actually Holocaust survivors. It's not even that their parents were. They themselves had fled the Holocaust. And they're saying, like, I'm not actually just a regular white oppressor. And it didn't matter. No one cared when they said this. This is also sort of the moment where we see the rise of whiteness studies, which feminist scholars did a lot to contribute to. And, I don't know if it's as famous where you are as it is here in America. Peggy McIntosh, who's a feminist scholar, she wrote Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. And this is in 1989. And it says that whiteness is a set of unearned privileges. And so it lists all kinds of privileges that white people would potentially have access to. And Peggy McIntosh actually said, not everyone would have access to this, but these are privileges that I have as a white woman. Peggy McIntosh is Protestant. She is not a Jewish woman. If you read all of the various privileges, you would realize that Jewish women not only don't always have access to them, but like in times of rising anti-Semitism really wouldn't have access to them. But there's, it doesn't account for history. It sort of makes Jews into white women. And the idea is actually that these women should be disempowered, right? So it's not, the civil rights movement in America had said, like, let's lift up minorities and get them to where everyone else is. And this is really saying something else. This is saying, like, let's demote people that we have decided are white. This will matter for Jews and Jewish women, and it will also matter for white women, because white women who have been saying, I'm oppressed, like, well, are you oppressed? You're white. You have all these privileges. And then I think the final really important theory at this moment, as you mentioned, is intersectionality. So in 1989, Kimberly Crenshaw is going to publish her famous theory of intersectionality. It's very much building on the Black feminism that has come before it. And the idea, as I'm sure many of you know, is that Black women are not the same as white women, nor are they the same as Black men, and they need to be treated differently, and that there are different vectors of oppression. So, could be gender, it could be race, it could be class, nationality, and that these vectors interact in different ways to produce people that she calls multiply burdened. And so, the way, as I think many of us know, that this gets taken up within feminism is that sort of all these vectors become experienced as like weighted. So it's like the more ways that you can claim that you're oppressed, like the more important you are in feminist theory. And one of the other things she had said in her essay is that Black women need to be centered. And part of this idea is like if you're really oppressed, you need to be centered. We need to decenter those people who are less oppressed. And so really, if you look at very early feminist texts, even in like the 1960s, women were already competing over who was most oppressed. But this codifies it, whether or not Crenshaw actually meant to. And this is the way that it gets taken up. And Jewish women will say this does not account for us. And there's different ways it doesn't account for Jewish women, but one of the main ways it doesn't account for Jewish women is that because, as we've already discussed, there's this idea that Jews are capitalists and greedy and rich, Jews will say, well, we're not oppressed because we're poor because everyone thinks we're poor. We're oppressed because people think that we're rich. And it just, there's no room in intersectionality for that. So I think when we're talking about things like socialism and socialist feminism, like that becomes intersectionality, and the way it can't account for Jews becomes very operative. And then, like, to get us a little bit closer to today, in 1990, we see the rise of queer theory. So Judith Butler comes out with Gender Trouble, and we are now saying that sex and gender are not the same, and that they need to be disaggregated. And a few years later, in 2003, they make what I think is a similar theoretical move. They say, like, Judaism, Jews and Israel, or Jews and Israel should need to be disaggregated. And so what Butler says is that not all Jews have a quote unquote seamless identification with Israel. So this, for Butler, this means anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, which is, and we hear this exact thing. I mean, I see it every day. We see it parroted all the time, and it's for the same reason. So even though most Jews, in fact, do support the existence of Israel, which does in fact already exist, and Israel is at the center of the religion. We all have family members who live there. We go there. All of those kinds of things. Butler says that these things should be disaggregated. And so in the 2000s, we just get a whole new slew of queer and feminist anti-Zionist literature, and it's extremely common throughout feminist academia. I would say probably some of the most important ones that people have probably heard of, the feminist and queer scholar Jasbir Puar, who actually often uses examples from the UK in her work. But she talks about how both the mainstream feminist movement and the mainstream gay and lesbian movement, when they are talking about, Arab countries not treating women or gays and lesbians well, they're comparing it to Western countries. And so what they're doing is they're racist. This is a racist way of looking at Arab countries. And so right, like now even, and it's not just Arab, other non-Western countries in general, but I think now I see this constantly when people are saying, where are the Western feminists with Iran? Well, one of the reasons you're not seeing Western feminists supporting Iran, and there's other reasons as well, but one is because they've been told that it's racist to do so, that this idea that the Western world is more modern is itself a racist idea. Jasbir Puar will also develop the concept of pinkwashing. So this idea that, yes, it's true, Israel treats gays and lesbians really well. And she says that. She says they have admittedly stellar treatment of gays and lesbians. But the reason they're treating gays and lesbians so well is because they're trying to deflect from how terribly they treat Palestinians. So again, like another conspiracy theory about Jews and about Israel. And the last, probably really, well, there's many, but another really important one is Angela Davis, who is going to shift the way that we talk about intersectionality and talk about an intersectionality of struggles. And so one of the things she says is that anti-Black racism in the US is the same as Israeli racism towards Palestinians. And Israelis would say, this isn't true. Our conflict isn't even about race. Our conflict is about two competing nationalisms. And so she makes them the same. And in her version of intersectionality, sort of every world problems that seem to have nothing to do with each other end up being the equivalent of each other, and they all end in some sort of condemnation of Israel. So you'll often hear people say it's all interconnected or it's all connected. That's that often is followed by some sort of condemnation of Israel, and that's where it's that version, that's that conspiratorial version of intersectionality. And the other really important thing that I think Davis does is she says in her book about Palestine. She says, I don't think of feminism as something that attaches to gendered bodies. I think of it as an approach or a method. So feminism doesn't belong to anyone. And I think this is like really what we see now is that we've gotten to a point where feminism has so little to do with women. It's sort of intersectionality and feminism gets handed over to the left to use against Israel and might not even have that much to do with us. I mean, here in the US, the feminist movement has been so focused on Israel. Meanwhile, we're losing abortion rights. So it is this thing that we think of as ours or that it's meant to help us. And it's doing these completely different things now through all of these sort of changes that have happened over these last several decades.
And that feels like a brilliant way to kind of end the first part, because we've already got 4 questions. Please do send more. Just the idea that fights within feminism about Zionism, which really no woman, I think in many ways, can do anything about the fact that Israel exists or how it behaves. Certainly not in the UK and perhaps a little bit more in the US, but not really. But all these fights, when actually as women we have so many bigger fights, particularly in America. But let's go to our first question.
Can I just say one tiny thing in response? Just what occurs to me is like, what has, because we're kind of, this event is kind of thinking about echoes from the past and how something's recurring, but it's a little bit different, I think, because what's changed is that all this stuff with Butler and just previous to Butler, all the academic work and everything Cara just described, it was still pretty niche. I don't think your average girl going to school, I certainly don't remember this in the 90s, would encounter any of these ideas. And what's happened is the leap into the mainstream. So there's a survey last week or something that something like a huge number of young women voters between 18 and 28 see Gaza as in their top 3 issues above anything else. And it's that leap out of academe, out of feminist circles that used to be somewhat, what we used to be called, well, let's just call it the fringe. And that's kind of that's this unnerving thing. And I suppose it's the way academia and academic ideas have bled into the most kind of mundane, widespread government institutions, culture, magazines, like girl power, all of it. And I find it very sad when I see the complicity of Jewish women in so much of this. And I don't think you get a free pass if you're Jewish at all. And I think that this expansion has kind of co-opted so many more people into it. And the final one, sort of one of the nails in one of the pieces is obviously Said's book Orientalism from 1978. So that seems to be one of the kind of, that's it. We've got the template. The academic stuff can leap out of the academia, and now it's just everywhere. And that's why this problem has exploded on such a massive scale. And I think that's what's changed. Anyway.
I think I just want to say, and also then the internet, right? Like so many girls were on, even, 10 years ago, women who are now still young women, but didn't have some power. It's like they were on Tumblr, and they were sharing, when I would look, I did my dissertation on Tumblr. But it's like they were sharing these actual texts, like they were sharing this bridge called My Back, which is like the most important text to the formation of women of color feminism. And so like these things were circulating, as you're saying, Zoe, like they were circulating outside of academia. You didn't need to take a women's studies class to learn these things.
Yeah. I mean, actually, we don't have a question about anti-Zionist Jews, but I think it's something that we probably should discuss at some point, especially as Judith Butler is Jewish. But I'm going to maybe I'm going to do 2 questions at a time, I think, just because you're both brilliant talkers, but we've only got another half an hour. So the first is from Susan. Jews have been seen, certainly since the early 20th century, as strongly associated with socially liberal causes. For example, it was common to see Soviet references to Zionist queers in the USA. Jews were central to the civil rights movement. How far do you think that plays into the current anti-Jewish feeling, both on the progressive left, which is illiberal, and Islamist conservatism? And the other question is, if anti-Semitism was there from the very beginning in feminism, how on earth do we reclaim it today? I don't know.
What was that last question again? If what was there?
There from the very beginning. If
anti-Semitism was there, how do we reclaim feminism? Okay.
how do we reclaim it? I suppose they're two quite different questions. So I don't know if you want to take one each, or if you want to both think about them both. But remember, we have quite a few questions to get through.
Cara, you should start.
I mean, I will say quickly that Zoe, you were talking a little bit about how British feminism very much came out of these other liberatory movements, and American feminism did too. Many of the early feminists, I mean, you listed a whole group of important early Jewish American feminists, and they were all Jewish. So I think that does have, I think that absolutely has something to do with it. I think there was, there's the stereotype of the overbearing Jewish woman. And I think there was this, I mean, they actually talked about it. Like, women of color feminists would say, Jewish feminists are trying to take over the movement. So I think that very much played into this idea. I said it was represented by Betty Friedan, but Jewish women in general were seen as just too powerful. And you look like you were going to say something, Zoe, were you?
No, when you're finished. That's my natural.
I was just going to say, I don't know if I know. If I think about it, maybe I would know how to reclaim it. But I think that intersectionality did do a really important thing. I think this idea that we're not just, that there are all these different ways of being oppressed is sophisticated, important. Many of the texts that came out of these moments are very beautiful to read, including some of the ones that are quite terrible to Jews. But I think that's why they're well written and compelling. But I think now that we know that, we should hold on to the idea that oppressions can interact in different ways. But I think we also might want to go back to thinking about this idea of sisterhood, or of women, supporting each other internationally, and thinking about we do have different issues than the rest of the left has. And I think that I think there might be like in the very beginning of feminism, of second wave feminism, a lot of the anti-Jewish sentiment was latent, which makes me a little bit hopeful. I feel like we do need to go back to think about some of those earlier ideas that were actually good ideas that got jettisoned as we move to this more identity-based feminism that was about women sort of confronting each other.
I would just very briefly say, to the first question, Jews cannot win. That's the thing to take home. Yes, massively important in civil rights movements, South Africa, gay rights, you name it. Nothing to do with how we're perceived. Everything is weaponized against Jews, if you want. I mean, you can turn anything against Jews, including the Holocaust. So that's kind of just the way it is. And therefore, those things, I think, have to be seen in that light. And in that sense I have a bit of a dim view in number 2 of how to reclaim. No, I think we can't be in the club. We're in an age of separatism. The ship has sailed. I think it's down to other women to try to beg us to come back, frankly. Not beg, but be interested. I think Jewish women, we can't win, and we can't be in the club that hates us under guise of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and all that stuff. So I think this kind of thing is great. And it doesn't have to be just Jewish women. It's anyone who understands the issues, welcomed with open arms. But this idea of maybe this thing will let us be let back in, it just never works. So I think just being strong and, on our own, doing our own thing. And by the way, I don't even think it needs to be just left wing. I think it's all about intellectual diversity. It's all about just keeping hold of the one thing, which is we are not taking the crap of, we are not going to swallow this idea that the Jewish state is to blame for everything, and Jews are its emissaries everywhere who should be, the fall girls for everything. And it's just at its root an evil and false set of ideas. And until other women and people choose to see it that way and understand the way that they are contributing to really nasty, evil things, then they can have their movement. That's my view.
Agreed. That's better than what I said. I agree with you, Zoe.
Yeah, I think sisterhood, unfortunately, is impressed.
And I should just say that most of the founders of this movement aren't Jewish, so we do have these allies, which is
Great.
Yes.
So appreciated.
So the first question is kind of similar. We've kind of touched on, but a little bit, but which is how did the left-wing feminist movement, especially in America, ignore the fact that Jews were prominent in the civil rights movement and anti-apartheid movement? So again, I guess we have kind of talked about that, but you might want to go back on that in that almost it's been turned back against us. And can you account for women's silence on this issue? Why were women willing to cede ground on women's rights in favor of race-related rights? Is there something in the idea of suicidal empathy idea or something seductive about allowing Jewish women to take the hit? Which I would say there is. On a related note, were any women speaking out about this? You mentioned Felicity. Was she the left yelling into the void? Why were there no other voices? Is it literally social embarrassment and wanting to seem racist? And is anti-Semitism the price to pay for that?
The first question was about, right, how could we see Jewish women as racist? Yes, after we had been so involved in the civil rights.
Yeah.
So it is so interesting.
Before you carry on, I was just going to say, I was really touched by the fact that you mentioned, so there's this magazine set up by Jewish feminist lesbians, and they're allowing the publication of anti-Semitic tracts in their own magazine.
And it's so interesting because in the magazine, at following one of these poems, it says, "We realize that maybe this is a little incendiary, and we will have a conversation between Black and Jewish women," which they did publish 2 years later. But yes, absolutely. I mean, because the truth of the matter is Jewish women have typically really cared about race. So they really did want to share their power with Black women. They really did care about these issues. And it's so interesting to read feminist texts over the last several decades, because what happens is you get these more and more absolutely outlandish ways of calling Jews racist, because, their participation in the civil rights, we either hear that, well, we didn't really, most of us didn't really participate in how many of us were really on the front lines, as though there's not all kinds of different ways. There's so many ways to try to achieve civil rights. The idea that, you weren't actually in Mississippi doesn't seem to me like a realistic way of saying that Jewish women are racist. But it gets even more and more outlandish. Like when we get to more contemporary times, and often these texts are written by Jewish women. It's by Jewish women. When we get to more contemporary times, it's by Jewish women as much as it's by anyone else. And they will say things like, well, the way that Jews make themselves into a model minority is by degrading Blacks. And then it gets even wilder. Like, I'm just thinking of this one text where the Jewish feminist writer quotes a woman of color who says, I'm trying to remember exactly what it is. It's something like, swastikas are, they're for us too, and it's worse for us because you have white privilege and I don't. And I mean, you have no idea what she's talking about at all. It's just like, and the whole book is just like a litany of possible reasons where Jewish women could be considered racist. And even with the civil rights, it's just like, there's also this contradictory idea, which is that there were so many of us, so maybe we were trying to take over. I mean, it's just, as Zoe said, you can't really, you can do no right here.
Yeah. In terms of women that spoke out, I feel like probably in America there were more allies than there may have been in the UK, but let me know, ladies.
That would be probably a Cara question to answer. Although, Nicole, when we did our research for our piece, I mean, there were clearly some allies in the UK movement, but they're just on it's just a more domestic, it's a smaller scale. But I mean, they were there, but I mean, there's a reason that those voices aren't amplified and particularly remembered in history. I mean, it's like
the piece that we wrote, I spoke to Sheila Jeffries, and she talked about,
and she's a major figure for sure. Yeah.
And she talked about Spare Rib and how she helped host an event to basically attack Spare Rib. And the interesting thing, one of the interesting things for me was her talking about that, because she wanted to then demonstrate outside Spare Rib, and the Jewish women inside were crying and saying, please don't, because you're going to make it worse. And that is one of the issues, isn't it? In that, because we are a scared minority, particularly in Britain, it's sometimes we really need our allies to be louder than us, and for us not to have to do it, because we know whatever happens, we're going to be attacked.
But I think that one of the big problems here, and why this issue hasn't gone away and has come back so badly, is that it's that exact thing. Jewish women have allowed their fear, they've been too invested in the approval of the movement, which is understandable because it's such an all-consuming, thing for, it's a whole system of politics and morality. But there's never been a group of progressive, post-1970s, Zionist, feminist women who say, I don't just want to ask questions about it and have the freedom to have my voice published and talk about the Holocaust. I am whether I'm a Zionist or not, this is unacceptable to not, we are proud Zionists. We believe this, we believe that, we believe the other, and ruffle every feather going. And it's this persistent attempt to still be accepted and to still be unsure to keep the moral waters muddied, which are not muddy. Whether or not you agree with everything Israel does, that's a separate issue to the moral questions here. And I think when we waste so much time and energy, and have done for decades, wrapping ourselves in knots, trying to unpick all the crazy ways that are used to delegitimize, or I should say, to legitimize the harming of us, because that ends up being the end result. But the word that has to be in there, I think, and I'd forgotten about it, but it's anti-rational. This stuff is all, that's Kara said so perfectly, how none of it makes sense. It's like, what? But you can, once you accept that these are anti-rational memes, which I think is the kind of term that epistemologists would use, then you start to understand that you are dealing with deeper logics of anti-Semitism and trying to kind of understand, superficial, examples of it. You just get hurt. It's like knocking your face against a brick wall again and again and again, more and more bruises and cuts, instead of understanding what the wall is. And that's why I think kind of this more separatist model for now, with a kind of more Jabotinsky-esque, if you will, view about this is what we stand. We don't mind if you hate Netanyahu but we are a Zionist. This is this, and we do not accept any of your mealy-mouthed justifications for anti-Semitic, anti-Zionism. We don't accept any of it. And to stand up and do that's something for understandable reasons, totally understandable reasons. I don't think, especially British Jewish feminists, have felt emboldened to do. And I know they've been up against incredibly sort of unpleasant, scary things. And I'm not sure I'm so courageous that I would do it if I was in the heart of the movement. But I do think that's the issue. And I think we would have made more progress by now had there been that kind of proud Zionist, Jewish, progressive, feminist group.
And Caro, just before we go on to the next questions, are there any, have there been any amazing allies that you can think of?
You mean sort of other groups or other?
Or kind of well-known feminists who have kind of stood up and said, no to this?
I mean, it's, not really. I mean, the 80s were this moment where there were Jewish feminists who really stuck up for themselves, and they produced all kinds of amazing literature where they, were talked about their love of Israel, but also about its problem. They were trying to be very even-handed, and it really starts to change then in the 90s. And in fact, some of the people who had written more positive things earlier on their work ends up becoming sort of crucial to anti-Zionism later. So I really think I think what Zoe is describing is like, it's very disorganized. I would like it to be more organized. every once in a while, it's like you'll get a letter by somebody in the New York Times or something like that. That's a great letter that's about Jewish feminism and says some of the things that Zoe just said. But, it's really just a moment in time. It's not sort of, so I wish I could say yes, but I don't know that I can think of anyone.
Okay. Okay, a couple more questions. And apparently there are people with their hands up, but we at the moment we're just taking written questions. If you do want to write something for the Substack, then please do. I know that there are probably women with memories of certainly spare rib or other times that they might want to write about. Definitely get in touch with one of the ladies from Feminists Against Antisemitism. And I know that there are more plans for more things, including a chat with Sheila, who we've talked about. But in the meantime, I'll just go back to a couple more questions. One from Harriet Whaley Cohen, seeing the same pattern in the corporate sector, i.e. Jewish people being declined entry or inclusion into minority spaces and categories on many levels and being told we cannot join in as we're white and privileged. DEI efforts, I think it's also called EDI in America, are often not inclusive of Jewish women in the same way they are of other groups. I know why I think this is, but why do you think this is? And the second question is, if all of these modern academic theories have anti-Semitism baked in, what comes next? The backlash against postmodernism and critical theory is already beginning, but we know how the far right is as bad as the far left. What does this mean for feminism and Jewish women going forwards? And that might be, as we are now at about 15:15 or 18 minutes past, a good time to end it, which is what next? And can we see any light there? So the first is about DEI, which is certainly problematic in many ways, and something that I suppose in some ways we've covered it more in a kind of academic sense, but how that has gone out into the wider world. And then what happens now that we are beginning to see a backlash, and particularly in America, we're seeing from the right a lot of anti-Semitism there too.
I think DEI emerges from a similar place that may even have academic roots that are very similar to intersectionality. And DEI uses the same dynamics to stack the odds against Jews. So it's inevitable that it will end up being anti-Semitic, to be perfectly frank. In fact, I have, academic friends who work on projects to do with Jewish history, told they cannot in any way be part of the BAME, which is British Minority Ethnic. I think it's a disused term now, but anyway, or Black History Month. Okay, not Black History Month, but part of the BAME part of the website. And this is, again, we have to get out of the habit of thinking this is a strange coincidence. It is not. It is by design, in my view, which is admittedly a bit of an extreme and apocalyptic view. But I think that these ideas are completely intermingled with deeply anti-Semitic logics, and they all come from the same place. And I write for the Telegraph. And one of those favorite words of our newspaper is woke. And I've moved away from it because it's started to become a bit meaningless. And also, I don't want to be one of these, like, a lot of the anti-woke people have become insane on many other issues. So that's a shame. But I think, understanding woke is still a useful basket of, it's a term, it's a kind of, an umbrella term for ideas that kind of have the same origin. And just because DEI is the kind of applied version in a corporate or even in academic whatever sense, it doesn't mean it doesn't have those same roots as the most academic of ideas.
I agree with Zoe that I think that feminist scholarship is DEI very much relies on feminist scholarship. Like, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack is a really important essay throughout DEI. So I think that's why we see it there, and that's how far it has moved outside of feminism. And the other thing the thing I would say, women's gender sexuality studies, whatever we are calling it these days, I am not feeling optimistic about. Like, these ideas are so prevalent. I don't see how anyone could ever get a job in one of these departments who wasn't saying these things, who didn't agree with these ideas. We know that these departments have taken explicit anti-Zionist stands. But I am more optimistic about feminist movement in general, just because I think that women do want their various rights and freedoms. And it actually made me feel a little bit, in some way, I've been working on this book for several years. And at some point it occurred to me like, oh, maybe it's great that nobody, before October 7th, everyone was like, what are you talking about that there's anti-Semitism in the feminist movement? And I thought like, well, maybe that's actually a good thing that so many women who care about feminism don't feel like they don't know about it and they don't feel this way. And maybe once they do know about it, something will change. Now, who knows? But I do feel like, I feel like women still want what feminism offers, not the anti-Zionist feminism, but what we think of as a more mainstream feminism. So I'm hoping younger feminists, I'm hoping that as women see like how far we've gotten distracted from these concerns, that maybe something new will happen.
Yeah.
Fortunately, I take a more negative view, and I don't see that happening because the U.S. has, as you mentioned, abortion as a kind of absolute, like, prime feminist issue to do with fundamental, basic women's rights. And I don't see the movement becoming obsessed with abortion to the exclusion of everything else. We've seen it move from the trans issues to this and between them, and if it was going to change shape, it would have done so, I would have imagined, and that's shocking. And I think this question of what's next, it's true. People like, I feel completely politically homeless. I mean, the right is mad, and now increasingly, especially in the US, extremely anti-Semitic. And the left, we don't need to go back over that. So I do think but then, I'm not a movement person. I think collectives tend to the bad quite often, not all. I mean, funnily enough, Zionism is the one ism I would happily, fight for and be part of and am. But I do think there has to be a slightly more, actually just using this, maybe the silver lining is this is an opportunity to bravely move away and do something else that still achieves women's ends, but does it in a genuinely safe space, not the misuse of term safe, but safe. So I think this has to be that opportunity, not another attempt to kind of get back into the club that doesn't want you, and is designed to keep you out. Forget that. So I think the future will be bright if women of all stripes, colors, religions, backgrounds, heritages, nationalities, who understand the foul tricks that have been played against Jewish women, but including by some Jewish women, and I do not let them off the hook in the slightest, then you could have a really powerful new branch of the movement that is morally courageous, clear, understands the difference between right and wrong. And what better, like, equipment for fighting the real and good fights, as Julie Bindel would say, women are still murdered by men, beaten up by men, raped. I mean, there's really serious, pressing, long-standing, fundamental feminist concerns that are neglected. And I think Jewish women or Zionist women or women who aren't Jewish or even necessarily Zionist, but just what I just said before, could be a really powerful kind of new squadron in the army against that or something. Sorry, run out of metaphorical juice there, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. Okay, so there's a few more questions. We've only got about another 6 minutes. So I'm just going to quickly go through them and then maybe pick one or something. People don't know about the terrifying rise in anti-Jew violence in England, London. They expect to find reports on this in the BBC and Guardian, which of course you won't get. Does anyone publish a recent roundup of anti-Semitic violence? And I'll just answer that and say the CST does something every 6 months. The Jewish Chronicle, the Jewish News, they both host. I write a lot about it on my Twitter and my Substack. There's definitely places where you can see it. Another question is, do panelists see the role of how do they see them of organized disinformation campaigns, and how important of that is in the current problem, particularly in regard to state actors? And then there's a question about Iran and why women aren't really talking about that. Then there's a question about the conflation of Ashkenazi Jews with whiter skin. Is that because they never met Mizrahi or Sephardic Jews? the may and is that a problem? And I don't know if that. I think that's probably a little bit deep to get into this time, but you might want to in terms of the fight within Judaism, which I was talking about with Cara yesterday. Just that when we were fighting Corbyn, I could see American Jews were fighting each other about Jews were white or not. So it's certainly a fight that's happened within Judaism, which I don't think should. There's another one saying, I'm amazed that as a British Jew over the age of 50, I was so largely unaware of all of this. It's so relevant to the wider issue of exploding anti-Zionism. I'd love to know that your insights are being shared amongst the brilliant new thinkers like Adam Louise Klein. And another person asked about the fact that Qatar is spending billions to ensure anti-Semitism becomes part of the teaching in all areas. So don't know if there's anything that you want to answer or discuss with all that, and then I will try and get us clear in about 5 minutes. If there's anything out of any of those that you want.
I just want to say thank you to the person who mentions Qatar and these misinformation campaigns. That to me is like potentially the biggest threat of all. I mean, if you read these, like Barry Weiss's story about, all the money and all the kind of, I mean, it's funny, people accuse Jews of having tentacles. Qatar has tentacles, like all the vested interest, the people who are in their pay, and then the lengths to which respectable Western leaders and governments will go to pretend that Qatar is an ally, and it's all kind of totally above board when it's Hamas lives there in mansions and it wants it to be like that. So that is that could even be the biggest issue for all of this, that blows all of these other issues out of the water, because nobody is, we aren't even at this point yet in the West where we are talking in any plain terms whatsoever about Qatar. And it's because so many people seem to be in its pay. And that's, of course, part of the the disinformation campaigns, which are, they find they're willing idiots who want to believe that stuff. But yes, it's all part of this huge machinery that has so much money, and it's going to be really, really hard to fight that. So that's all I'd say, really.
Questions, take your
the first thing I would say is, and I'll say it in 30 seconds, is my husband made me a website for my book last night, and he said I absolutely had to mention it while I was here. So feministantisemitismbook.com. So if you're interested, it's forthcoming from Routledge in June or July. But now that that's done, I think actually, so the sort of fight that Jews were having with one another about what is now called Ashkenazi normativity, or the idea that that Jews with white skin or Jews who have European roots put themselves at the center of Jewish history and don't pay attention to Jews of color who actually, there's many, many Jews of color in Israel. That has actually become one of the ways that Jews are accused of being racist. And so, Jewish anti-Zionists will often, they will really play up this idea of sort of this idea that like Jews are racist towards other Jews. And that's one that we see that like has gone outside of the Jewish community, even though I think the Jewish community has done so much to try to make it so that we are much more attentive to Jews of color.
Yeah. So I'm just asking any of the ladies who are hosting the event if any of them want to sign off. Otherwise, I will. But I just want to say thank you so much, everybody, for listening in. This is just the first of what we hope is many events. Freya's going to come on, so which is good, to tell us more about some of the plans. And obviously, I think the hope is that this is a safe space where we are not attacked, where we can discuss important issues, and when we can get together as feminists with our many different issues. And anti-Semitism doesn't have to be a discussion of all of these topics. Over to you, Freya. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I will end very quickly, if you bear with me, everyone online. What an incredible conversation. I've learned so much. I have so many questions I could ask. Cara, we're all saying on the WhatsApp groups, please do come back when your book is launched. We would love to chat with you, and we will share your website, and we will share your book once it's available on sale. I'd like to end by echoing Deirdre's comment about allies. As Nicole mentioned, Feminists Against Antisemitism was founded by a mix of Jewish and non-Jewish women, and so many of the women on the webinar tonight are not Jewish. Every time we stand together, we grow stronger and braver and bigger. We are running an ongoing series on our Substack, hearing from non-Jewish women as to why they are in this fight. So please do share your stories with us. The link was shared in the chat, and we're also going to be sending an email out to every ticket purchaser. We'll include links to the books that were talked about tonight, any articles, websites, whatever we've managed to collect, we will share with you, as well as a link to our Write For Us page. If you were there at Spare Rib, if you were a reader, if you were a contributor, come and tell us your stories. If you were there in the 80s and the 70s, we want to know. And if you're doing something today, whether that be as a Jewish person or as an ally, please let us know and let us share and amplify your voices. I'm afraid we did run out of time to really answer all of those questions, but you've got our Substack, you've got our X, we will address them, and we've got a lot of future events planned as well. Phyllis Jesella has been mentioned a few times tonight. We've been chatting with her, and we'll be sharing those conversations with you all soon. Her work is incredible, and please do subscribe to her Substack as well. We also got to sit down, I got to sit down with a personal heroine of mine, Professor Rosa Friedman, just recently. We've recorded that as part of our very first video podcast series. We'll be sharing that again on our X and Substack very soon. This is only the beginning. We thank you so much for your support, for everyone who donated and brought a ticket. We will be putting on more events, and we will be putting out more content, and we will be growing bigger thanks to you. Thank you again to our speakers. You've been absolutely incredible. And to our audience, we will see you soon.